Alrighty class, we're back and we are going to get into the 1980s with this video. Now the 1980s in American history is characterized by the presidency of Ronald Reagan, and what he's going to do is pretty much seek to end the Soviet Union, and he is going to end up basically doing it. The Soviet Union crumbles in 1991, 2 years after Reagan's last year. But Reagan pretty much laid the groundwork for like the final punch against the Soviet Union to knock them out, and for the U.S. to win the Cold War, which, as you know, has been going on since 1945, basically since World War II ended. So a long time. And yeah, there's Reagan riding a Velociraptor, shooting a machine gun, and carrying the American flag. Down here we have George H.W. Bush. So you remember there's two guys named George Bush that were president. This is the first one. This is his dad. George W. Bush is going to be the president during 9/11. And then to the right we have Bill Clinton, who's the president for most of the 90s. All right, 1980 election. We have Jimmy Carter against Ronald Reagan. And as we know that, Jimmy Carter was a great human being, but during his presidency, it wasn't that great. The economy tanked. And so here's the big matchup. Yeah, so you had the inflation, you had the energy crisis with the gas shortages. Carter looked weak. It's the Iranian hostage crisis going on. Ronald Reagan destroys Jimmy Carter in 1980 election. Ronald Reagan in the 1950s was an actor, a very famous actor. And as president, one of his nicknames is the Great Communicator. Because as an actor, as someone who's been in front of cameras his whole life, he really knew how to send a message, through film and communicate with people, and he just had this sort of nature about him. So that there's a couple, and he would joke a lot during like debates and stuff, and he always was quick with like a one-liner. There's a famous one where it was during the primaries for the Republican nomination, where Reagan was pretty old, as you can see. I believe at the time he was elected, he was the oldest president to be elected. That record has since been broken, but what was I going to say? Oh, there was a famous line where the moderator asked Ronald Reagan, people have talked about your age, and should that be an issue? Should age be an issue in this election? Basically trying to get Reagan to say, no, even though I'm old, I can do it. And he turns it right back around against his opponent and says, I don't think age should be an issue. I wouldn't want to criticize my opponent on his youth and inexperience. And that drew this huge laughter from the crowd, and Reagan was full of little quips and comebacks like that. So what's Reagan all about? He wants to lower taxes to free up more money. So it's simple. The less that you pay in taxes, the more money that you have to take home in your paycheck. He wants to deregulate business, so put less rules on businesses so they can grow faster. Reduce corporate taxes, so lowering taxes all around so that people and companies can do with their money what they want, rather than the money going to the government. One of Reagan's famous quotes was, "Government isn't the solution to the problem, government is the problem." And so this is what we call conservative economics, which is going to be, if you look at FDR or Lyndon Johnson, who had these huge government programs, lots of spending, lots of taxes, Reagan's basically the exact opposite. He said, that's not the way to go. We need to have more money, less government, and more individual. People should do with people should do with their money what they want. So, and that's still a big dividing point between Democrats and Republicans. Taxes. Should the government be bigger and funded by more taxes, or should the government be smaller and funded by less taxes? There's other issues too, but that is at the core of economics between Republicans and Democrats. That's the deal. And Reagan, just to be clear, is a Republican, and he's fighting back against the policies of Democrats like FDR and Lyndon Johnson. And also traditional values he ran on. So the 60s and 70s were pretty crazy. We talked about the hippies a lot, and the sexual revolution. And in the 70s, one part we had to skip was the rise of serial killers and cults and just craziness in the 70s. And Reagan's like, we have lost our traditional values in America. So he has what's an organization called the Moral Majority, and this is where a lot of the Republican base is formed by evangelical Christians who want to just go back to traditional morality. This term Reaganomics, that's just a nickname for Reagan's economic policy right here. And if you ask someone, was Reagan's economic policy, did it work or did it fail? If they say it worked, I guarantee they're a Republican or at least or conservative. If they say it failed, then I almost guarantee they're Democrat or liberal. So we're getting into modern history now where people have opinions. Your parents might have strong opinions. They might love Reagan, they might hate Reagan. So I'm going to be as neutral as possible. And since I'm an idiot when it comes to math, I don't really have a position on his economic policy because I just don't know. So anyway, that's Reagan in a nutshell. I'm going to put up a couple videos of him. One of them is going to be, hoping it's still up on YouTube and I haven't taken it down, a skit from Saturday Night Live. But anyway, let's get on with this. He wins a landslide in 1980, so all the red states vote for Reagan. So not as much as Nixon's landslide in 72, but he destroyed Jimmy Carter in this election. Okay, now the irony about Reagan and wanting to reduce the government, at the same time, since the Cold War is going on, he is going to take a lot of the money that the government has and just build up the military like crazy. It's called peace through strength. We will have peace if we're so strong that nobody will attack us. That was what's also known as the Reagan Doctrine. And he worked with Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain in the 1980s, and Pope John Paul II, JP2, who grew up in Poland, communist-occupied Poland, and as Pope, he, during his entire papacy, he wanted to undermine and get rid of communism completely, and especially in his home country of Poland, where he'd grown up and seen all of the oppression that happened to the Polish people under Soviet communism. Lincoln. Wow, okay. Reagan is going to go back to Berlin, to the same spot where JFK had the Ich bin ein Berliner speech. And he has a famous quote. We're going to watch the speech called, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And it comes down in 1989. And if you remember what I said about the Berlin Wall as sort of the symbol of the Cold War, while the Cold War heats up like crazy when the Berlin Wall goes up, in 61, the Berlin Wall comes down in 89, and the Soviet Union collapses only 2 years later. Because with Reagan's spending so much money to build up the U.S. military, he sort of reignites things, the arms race. And so the Soviets, then they're like, we have to keep up with the United States, and they're going to spend a ton of money. And eventually their country goes bankrupt, and they totally fall apart. And that's the end of the Cold War, and the United States wins. Reagan Doctrine, like I said, is peace through strength. Weakness only invites aggression. So just think, if you're a robber and there's a small scrawny guy and a big tough guy who looks like he lives at the gym, who are you going to try to go pick a fight with? Not the big tough guy. So that's what Reagan wants to do, is be so strong that there's no attack, because the other side knows they would lose. And what he also is doing is training and arming and sending funds to anti-communist organizations all over the world. He's going to get in trouble for this, one in the short term, another one in the long term, which no one could have foreseen, but we'll get into that later. And so the United States is funding groups in Central America, Afghanistan, and the Middle East. Because again, if they're fighting communism, he wants to help them out. So, and this is what's called a proxy war, when one country backs another one in a war. So the U.S. had gotten directly involved in Korea and Vietnam. Both the North Koreans and North Vietnamese were funded by the Chinese and the Russians. Those were proxy wars for them. Now it's the U.S.'s turn to fund other countries to fight directly against the Soviet Union. Proxy is a fancy word for someone is in your place. So the first big one the United States gets involved in is Afghanistan. And in the last video, as you saw, under the Carter administration, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. They wanted to take it over. And now, if you know anything about Afghanistan, the main religion there is Islam. And very fundamentalist, like super duper Islam. And remember, one of the key tenets of communism is that no person, no thing, no God can be more important than the state. So how are a bunch of fundamentalist Muslims going to react to an ideology which wants to pretty much wipe out their religion? Not too well. And these are people called the Mujahideen. And so they are these Afghanistan freedom fighters who are fighting back against the Soviet invasion. And they're doing it with money and with weapons that they get from the United States. And their leader, don't know if you've looked at the thing, but we'll see this guy later. Osama bin Laden, who, if you don't know the name, make sure you do. He was the ringleader, he was the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks. So, in the mid-1980s, he's being supported by the United States government in his fight against the Soviets. By 2001, he leads the biggest terrorist organization in the world and orchestrates the attacks on September 11th. This is the one where I said Reagan, no one could have known that the consequences of this one. It was many years later, but his bin Laden's success in the war against the Soviets gave him international recognition and like sort of celebrity status in the Islamic world, and that's how later on he's going to turn that into him leading a terrorist organization. All right, here's where Nixon. Wow, first I called him Lincoln, then I called him Nixon. All right, so I guess I am remaining objective. You guys don't know if I like Reagan or not because Lincoln's awesome and Nixon went down. Had to resign because he was such a liar. All right, oh man. Last week of school just got to push through. Iran-Contra scandal. So this is a bit complicated, so bear with me. And during the mid-1980s, there's the war between Iran and Iraq. The U.S. is selling weapons to both sides. Why would we do that? It is very sneaky. Iran and Iraq were typically against each other. The majority, they sort of form what's called a balance of power, which means as long as none of them are too powerful in the Middle East is pretty stable. But if one were to take over the other, it would be bad for world peace. Okay? That's just in a nutshell. Very simply. So they're at war with each other. The U.S. is helping both of them stay at war, hoping that nobody wins. And that's basically what happened. At the same time, in Nicaragua, there is a communist revolution going on. It wasn't an instant one, but in 1979, a group called the Sandinistas, they start to lead this communist revolution, and they're fighting against the government in power. You have a group called the Contras, or Contra is Latin for against, like when we say pro or con, the con is a short form of Contra. Is supported by Reagan because they're fighting the communist Sandinistas. Now, the Congress had passed something called the Boland Amendment, and this is not like a constitutional amendment. This was an amendment to a different law. It doesn't matter. And it says the president can't unilaterally send American money to foreign powers to instigate revolution. Unilaterally is a word that means all by himself, all his own decision. So if the president's going to fund some revolution in some country, he has to get Congress's approval. Because they knew Reagan wanted to help the Contras. So what happens? Reagan helps the Contras, unilaterally violating the Boland Amendment. And this Colonel Oliver North, he was the one who was kind of in charge of it. And he got caught. the weapons that had been sold to Iran in this conflict up here, the money that the U.S. made was going to the Contras to fight the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So we've got 3 countries, this kind of weird triangle, but it was illegal. Oliver North never said that Reagan was involved, probably because he didn't want to out Reagan. Reagan said, "That's my fault. I'm the president. I should have known, but I had no idea this was going on, guys." And without anyone confessing that Reagan did know, there's nothing to convict or bring articles of impeachment against Reagan. Reagan never admitted it. No one ever admitted it. Reagan probably knew, but kept quiet, saying that this is in the name against fighting communism, so it's the right thing to do. So it was this, what we call the Iran-Contra scandal. The Star Wars program. Okay, Star Wars, what's going on here? This was a nickname for the Strategic Defense Initiative. And the media nicknamed it Star Wars because the Star Wars movies had recently come out in the past 4 or 5 years. The original Star Wars movies. And they thought Reagan's plan was so ridiculous that it was like a science fiction movie. So the Star Wars program, or SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, basically said, we'll have satellites or space stations, and they will be armed with missiles, so they can intercept an ICBM if the Soviets ever launch one. We can launch one from space to take down the nuclear bomb. Which is like, what? Are you crazy? And that's where they're like, oh, this is Star Wars. This is science fiction. And the scientists were like, this is basically impossible. But the Soviets are like, oh my God, Nixon's going to have like... wow. The Soviets are saying Reagan's going to have nukes in space. We got to get working on this. And so this is part of how Reagan helped bankrupt the Soviet Union, is he had them spending all this money on this nuclear space program, which could never ever exist. And this is part of what bankrupted them. The media said, Reagan, you are an idiot. You're dumb. This will never work. But it did work in the fact that it helped bankrupt the Soviet Union. So here is, and I hope this link works. It's a Saturday Night Live skit where, again, Reagan was an actor. Toward the end of his presidency, it looked like he was losing his mind a little bit, like it's getting like some signs of dementia. Was he acting with this whole thing? Was he acting with the Iran-Contra scandal and saying, I didn't know what happened, sorry? Or is he some kind of sneaky evil genius where he had this plan in advance and he was going to play it off like he was some doddering old man, but really he's running everything and he's this genius and his things are working? And so this is a great skit on SNL. Hopefully it works to kind of show the two views of Ronald Reagan. We're going to stop this video for now because the next is going to focus on Berlin.